Okay, hi everyone once again, and welcome to our today's session. And today we have our last guest lecturer, that is Olesya Khanina from Helsinki, who is a specialist on multilingualism in the North and in Northern Eurasia in general, but she has also done a lot of work on ENETs and Samoyedic languages in general. I guess, Olesya, you can start sharing your screen. So now we are ready to start. And the topic of today's presentation is typology of language spreads and language spreads in the Arctic. And Olesya, we are very happy to have you here. Thank you very much for agreeing to take part in this course. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you hear me now. Yes, great. Thank you. Okay. As can be guessed from the title, there will be two parts to this talk. One will be a typological one, kind of a very general one, and maybe a bit more kind of hard to understand because of this. But then the second part will be more specific when I will try to apply this kind of wider theory to one particular part of the world, the Arctic. Okay, yes, and in the first part, I will try to introduce the idea of language spread and what kind of research questions can be asked to it. And then I will try to talk about how we can study language spreads. And if we manage to study them, many of them, how we can build a typology out of them, and which kind of studies actually exist in this field. Because this is something very new. I'm not sure you will get any results if you Google for typology of language spreads. It's really something kind of emerging, and many people who actually, I think, contribute to this kind of typology would never call themselves this name, because it's really being created from several sides by different people. But I suggest you in this lecture to look at it at kind of one whole. Okay, so the first part starts now. Okay, before I get into this, I was not sure whether Ksenia will introduce me or not. So yes, the main thing about me is that I have done many different things, and this is kind of typology of language spreads. It's such a general thing that you need to combine different expertise here. And so I started by writing my PhD in typology. So very kind of classical one, as you have been introduced to in the first two classes. And then I moved to documentation and description of ENETs, as Ksenia mentioned, which is a Samoyedic Uralic language. And then I was became interested in sociolinguistics of these small-scale indigenous communities. And because currently kind of many indigenous languages, in particular indigenous languages of Northern Siberia, are disappearing. So if we want to speak about traditional sociolinguistics, we will need to speak about historical sociolinguistics, basically. And so that's how I turned to history. And from historical sociolinguistics, I became involved into real historical linguistics. And then now I kind of am going beyond purely linguistics, but combining historical linguistics as a part of interdisciplinary reconstruction of the past. So this is kind of my background. And in terms of languages, I work with Uralic, specifically mostly Samoyedic languages, languages of Siberia, and languages of the Arctic. And of course, all of this, except my PhD thesis in typology, is a collective effort. So this is really wide topics which are hard to approach with a single expertise. So I think this needs to be kept in mind, that when we speak about this kind of broad topic like language spreads, we need really many expertise together. Okay, so typology of language spreads. What is a language spread? Actually, when I was preparing this slide, I decided to Google, and I have discovered that there is another understanding of what a language spread is, which is kind of micro level one, while I will deal with macro level. So we can understand language spread at a micro level as an increase over time in the proportion of communication network that adopts a given language or language variety for a given communicative function. And so if you, for example, think about spread of English in the 20th century in the Western world, this would be an example of this kind of language spread. So when one language is spread over more networks. However, in this class, when I refer to language spreads, I actually refer to language families, not to individual languages. And then language spread is understood as a process and result of language diversification and dispersal over landmass. And here we have these two important components, diversification and dispersal. Because diversification is, on the one hand, purely linguistics, like kind of what happens in languages when a proto-language becomes daughter languages. Also, sociolinguistic is very important here, kind of what happens to a language that it diversifies into several new languages. But also, when we have the second component, dispersal, we have this language in space issues and language in time, because usually language family, like from proto-language to language family, it takes hundreds or even thousands of years. So when we think about language spreads, we think about language families and how they diversify and occupy the place we see today. So that, like, we take Indo-European or Uralic, and we see all these languages spread over all these territories, but the proto-language was spoken on a much smaller territory and maybe a different in a different part of the world even. Yes, if we take this macro level understanding of language spread, then what kind of research questions we can ask to it? And here I kind of copied mostly the research questions which were given in the introductory paper to this wonderful book, Language Dispersal, Diversification and Contact. This books is called A Global Perspective, but actually they focus on several parts of the world and not on the Arctic. But this is that was kind of one of the first efforts to speak about language spreads more globally. And so the authors, Millie Kravels and Peter Moiskin, suggest the following research questions. How did the world's languages spread across the globe? And are there any regional trends, so that we can say that this is an African type of language spread, and this is an Australian type of language spread? Another question could be, why do we sometimes find large language families distributed over a wider area, and sometimes clusters of very small families or language isolates, like large language families like Uralic or Indo-European, and small families, clusters of small families would be like South America, for example. So is it just a chance, a coincidence that it happened like this in Eurasia, but like that in South America, or whether we can find any reasons for it? Another question could be, what was the role of different language ideologies and patterns of ethnic identity formation in generating the patterns of language spread that we see worldwide? What influence did geography or climate, as I add here, have on these patterns of language spread? And finally, are there any recurrent patterns indeed in the way language families diversify or disperse? Or is it just individual histories that cannot be generalized over because they are just unique? Okay, that were research questions. And now I go to the ways to answer them. So first of all, we need numerous language descriptions from all over the world. And if we speak about level of families, then we need descriptions of many families. And you can imagine that very recently it was not yet possible. So the fact that typology of language spreads is appearing here and now is because it was just, we didn't have enough data before. Even now we don't have enough data, but it would be great to have more data, but it's still something that can be, we already have much more language descriptions that we had like 20 years ago or even 50 years ago. And then how can we study them? We can borrow methods from several subdisciplines of linguistics. First of all, from historical linguistics, because this is a subdiscipline that knows how to reconstruct language histories and infer non-linguistic context from them. We can borrow methods from typology. So when we have large, diverse linguistic data at the level of families, how do we uncover recurrent patterns in this data? We can use methods from sociolinguistics because this is a subdiscipline which knows how to understand the interplay between social factors and language change. And if we think about dispersal over a landmass, this clearly that social factors are involved. And actually, we can also borrow, not really borrow methods, but borrow findings from populational genetics and archaeology as well, because population genetics knows how to identify human migrations and human mixture in the past. And like if we see a language spread and we have the information whether humans spread with the same genetic ancestry spread along the same territory, then we can know that that was a spread of language with humans. Or if we do not see human migration and spread of this genetic ancestry, but we see language spread, then we can infer that that was a spread by language shift, so that people didn't migrate, but they were so powerful and socially prestigious that their language was borrowed by some other groups of human. So this is really, the findings from population genetics are very relevant for studies of language spreads. And also the findings from archaeology, because they know how to identify communities of practice and dispersal of communities of practice in the past. And why genes, languages, and communities of practice are not obliged to go together. They can go together, and at least interesting hypotheses to explore can be seen from when this discipline exchange their results. Any questions so far?
Generally, people usually write their questions or comments in the chat. So at some point, you can just take a break and take a look at what you can find there. But otherwise,
thank you. Thanks to your comment, I have discovered a comment in the chat. Yes, there is a comment that language spreads also helps us understand how human migrations happen. Yes, exactly. So this is kind of an interplay of methods and a mutual exchange of findings which help each other, so that ideally all these disciplines work together. Okay. So imagine that we have used these methods and have studied some language spreads. How do we build a typology out of them? And here I suggest you to look at kind of 3 levels of typology by increasing complexity. So that kind of the oldest typology is typology of language units, and the most for which the most of typological studies actually exist. So that when we compare phonemes or grammatical categories or affixes or words across languages and make generalizations about them, and usually the source of information in this case would be grammatical descriptions or dictionaries. And currently, as I think you might know from the first introductory lectures, there are quite many data sets of the type of what kind of phonemes are possible across worldwide, what kind of words, clauses, and so on. So this is really we have already a lot of results here. Then we have typology of language change, when it's not individual units of modern languages, of synchronic languages are compared, but kind of generalizations about changes, like typology of sound change, or of semantic shift, of grammaticalization patterns. And for this, we need historical studies of individual languages. So grammatical descriptions alone would not be enough. And it's very good when we can compare languages within a family regarding this parameter. And there are already also data sets like this for databases of sound changes, of semantic shifts. Those are much less numerous than the data sets of units. And then we can go to kind of the next level of complexity when we think about typology of language spreads. And here we kind of are interested not in phonemes or grammatical categories, not in sound changes or semantic shifts, but in geographic expansions worldwide. Can we categorize them somehow? Do they form any patterns worldwide? We are interested in chronologies of language spreads. We are interested in the way how innovations spread in languages horizontally or vertically, for example. And actually, what kind of sources can be used and what kind of results can be produced, that's what my next slides tell you about. So this is a summary here so that you can refer later here to this slide. But now I will go to the types of studies. Here there are kind of two main approaches. One comes from case studies, and here I have pasted two book covers, which are collections of such case studies. One is devoted, which is called The Language of Hunter-Gatherers. This is a collection of case studies of how individual families spread. And the other book that I have mentioned already is rather a collection of how language spreads happened in several areas. These are case studies, but this is in a sense a typology as well, because if you make your case study being informed by others' case studies, it's already a button typology, because you kind of look what people do in similar case studies, what kind of questions they ask, and you try to ask similar questions, and you try to compare your results, even though it's really very, very beginning of any typology. But even this very beginning is possible only now when we have many descriptions of languages of the same family, of the same area. And also we have very few but existing generalizations made on these case studies, which try to analyze what are the dispersal patterns which we see in these case studies. And the most famous generalizations are by Bob Dixon in the end of the 1990s, in the famous book of The Fall and Rise of Languages. And then Patrick McConville, also from Australia, produced a theory or suggested a theory in 2000s of how languages spread. And then John and Nichols since 1990s have been working on trying to generalize over possible types of spread. I will not present you these typologies partly because we don't have enough time, but partly also because they easily outdate when more case studies become available. And so it's great that they appear because it's kind of spiral development. When they appear, more people are motivated to do case studies because, okay, they suggest these interesting questions. But then the new round of case studies basically means that you need a new round of generalizations. Okay, I'll give you some example here, but I think I will skip it now. And then another type. So the first type is kind of you have case studies and you try to generalize over them. Another type is very different. It's generalizations made on static distribution of linguistic features in modern languages. But if you take huge number of features, then you can kind of try to see global tendencies. And these global tendencies would be kind of proxies for mechanisms of spread. So if you see that some feature is overwhelming in many languages of the world, then you can either suggest that it spreads easily, the feature itself, or the languages which have this feature spread easily and kind of win over languages which do not have this feature. I will show you some examples at the next slide. And also there are people and studies who question the very mechanisms of spread. So they're not really thinking of terms of typology maybe, but they also contribute to it. And again, I will have a separate slide on this mechanism soon. So now I suggest you to have a 5 minutes in breakout rooms and to try to answer the question. I gave you 3 recommended reading for this class. Maybe some of you have read some of this, maybe you have not, but you can now read the titles and try to guess what these papers are about. And I would like you to try to kind of classify these 3 papers into these types of case studies, kind of how do you think what fits where. And actually I will put into chat now the PDF file with this slide of types of studies so that you can refer to it. Okay, I hope you have it now. So can you try, if you have read the paper, you can share it with others, or you can try just to see from the title what kind of study you expect here. Okay, like, is it a case study? Is it a generalization of a collection of case studies? Or is it a generalization made on static distribution of linguistic features? Or whether this paper questions some mechanisms of spread?
Okay, then I'll do the following. I will open 3 breakout rooms, and you can choose which breakout room you go into. So, Olesya, could you please put again the slide with the yes, yes. So the first one is on Ugristik and hunter-gatherers. The second one on Northern Asia as a linguistic area, and the third one on geographical axis effects in large-scale linguistic distribution. So I'm opening those 3 breakout rooms, and you can choose the room that you want to participate in.
And you have 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. I think for the sake of time, I will just briefly tell you the answers. To my mind, the first was Hill the first. Yes, the paper by Jane Hill about UTAD's second languages is both a case study. So it comes from a collection of case studies, but also it tries to discuss kind of more generally what can be the ways to understand how a case study fits into a typology. And so it's kind of, in a sense, talks to a more general, at a more general level. And then we have paper by Nichols, which is on the one case is a case study of an area of Northern Eurasia, but also it is, she refers actively to her theory of how dispersal happens worldwide. And then the last paper by Tom Guldemann and Harald Hammarström actually is an example of many languages and some feature. I think what order is analyzed in that paper from like hundreds of languages, and whether we see any okay, yes, this is all together. Any connection between a pattern of what order and a geographical axis. And actually, I think they look at the variety of what order, not any specific what order. And one of the results is, they say it's tentative, but still they hint to the idea that there is more variety worldwide along the north-south axis than along the east-west axis, because when languages spread into the north-south, the northward or southward, they need to enter a different habitat, a different ecological zone, and so kind of more effort is needed, and to survive you need to interact more with those who live there, and so you would have more language contact, and languages would change because of this language contact, and so you would see more variety along this north-south axis. So that was an example of how you can kind of try to understand how languages spread, what are the mechanisms of spread, and what are the kind of typical features of spread if you see at synchronic distribution of features. And here I list you several more papers. This list is by no means exhaustive, just to give you an example of what kind of questions can be studied. For example, in the next paper by Clements and Rayan, they analyze phonological features, and they show that if you take phonological features of many languages of Africa, then you would get geographic zones from these phonological features, basically meaning that there is kind of areality, meaning language contact, and some spread of features by areas. And the next paper by Atkinson et al., 2008, they studied the level of lexical retention in language families. So the unit of analysis was a language family, and like how similar are languages lexically in a family, or how different they are lexically. And the amount of branching, like if there is a single branching, or like first it branched into several and then more and more. And they showed that if you have more branching, there would be less lexical retention. So that if languages split more, then they lose lexical items on the way. Or you can look at it like from a positive perspective, that they kind of consciously choose new lexical items in order to be more different from those from whom they are differentiating. And then there are two papers on Indo-European languages, because there are many Indo-European languages, they're well described, so you can have a big data set with just Indo-European languages. And in the first of them, the authors show that there is an areal tendency to simplification. So if some simplification happens in some languages, then there is a more probability than by chance that neighboring languages will also undergo simplification. And it kind of hints, also give you a hint about language spreads and spread of features. And okay, the last paper that I wanted to mention was by Natalie Hubler, 2022. And here she took about 200 features, structural features in Altaic languages, so in Tungusic, Turkic, and Mongolic, Japonic, and Korean. And she wanted to see kind of what is the rate of change of different features, so that if we have several families, and within these families there is also further branching, can we see that some features are more stable within families, and some features are less stable, so they kind of change more or change less. And so she uses synchronic data, but ultimately the question is diachronic, and the question refers directly to language spreads, like kind of when languages spread, when languages diversify, what is the rate of changes? Is it uniform for like phonology, morphology, noun, verbs, or is it different? Yeah, so this is the kind of examples of studies which approach the typology of language spreads by large-scale data sets and very refined statistical methods. And usually they all use distance between geographic location of modern languages as a proxy for social networks. Meaning that if languages are spoken close to each other, it means that the speakers can communicate with each other and form one social network. And actually, this is exactly what is problematic for the Arctic, because in the Arctic, distance is not a proxy for social network, as I will show you soon. Yeah, so there is this kind of direction of research. And then, as I say, people question the very mechanisms of language spreads. And here you can have works on multilingualism and language contact. You can have works on emergence of dialectal differences, kind of as a model that we can study and then expand it to kind of differences at the language level and family level. Then important direction of research is contact among related languages, because actually that's how languages diversify. They usually are in contact with the neighboring languages. It's not common that there is suddenly a geographic separation between groups of languages. So this is very neat picture that speakers separate, and that's why they diversify. But in most cases worldwide, actually, that's not how language spreads happen, but they happen by diversification in situ, so that there is very slow increase of geographic difference, but rather there is an increase of social difference for whatever reason. Okay, and importantly is that several researchers, including Peter Tradgill, has suggested that if we base our typology of language spreads on the kind of case studies of language families that we can study by comparative method, then we will be skewed to the last thousands of years, and we will be skewed to the Neolithic times. While like in pre-Neolithic, which was the most of human history, maybe languages spread differently. So this is also something that will be important when we speak about the Arctic. Okay, let's go to the Arctic. If you have any general question, this is good time to ask it in chat or orally. You can write it down and I will come back to it. When we speak about the Arctic, I will first introduce language families of the Arctic. Maybe this is quite evident, but good to repeat, or so that everyone knows which languages we are talking about. Then I will speak about, or you will also think about Arctic language spreads and the reasons for them. And then another important part is kind of, if we don't think about the history, but we think about what we see now, what would be the sociolinguistic profile of the Arctic communities, and the patterns of language diversification that we see here, how do they correlate to the sociolinguistic profile? And they do correlate. So this is really something to be considered together. And then I will conclude by saying what the study of Arctic spreads contribute to the typology more generally. Typology of language spreads. Okay, I want to show with the quiz that will help you to see what you know about language families of the Arctic. I will send the link to chat. Okay. No, that was a screenshot. Sorry. Good, thank you. Most of the answers were actually right, except the story of human inhabitants of the Arctic. Okay, so I need to. Oh, no, sorry. Okay, yes. So yes, the Arctic has been inhabited at least since 44,000 before present. So surprisingly long when you think about how unwelcome this environment is today. And you see here a picture of a mammoth that was discovered in Lower Yenisei area in northern central Siberia. This mammoth lived 44,000 years ago. And this picture, like the skeleton picture, shows by red where it was attacked by humans. So it was attacked by long, sharp objects from several sides. And also when it died, humans took away some parts of it, but clearly only valuable parts, but left the rest of it. Okay, and this is not the only, there is at least another one in, at the Lower Yana area, which is more to the east of Siberia, but also Arctic, with exactly the same dating when they had another mammoth with a part of arrow discovered in it. So yes, humans lived there for dozens of thousands of years. At the same time, the comparative method for linguistics cannot go beyond 10,000 years maximum. And actually, the eldest Arctic language families go back only to 4,000 years ago, so not even 10,000 years ago. Even though one of them, Chukotka-Kamchatkan family, linguistically, it goes back to 4,000 years ago, but modern Chukotka-Kamchatkan speakers have genetic ancestry which has been found in human remains, which go back to the culture which was 6,800 years ago. So, okay, at least for 6,800 years, we know that maybe predecessors of Chukotka-Kamchatkan languages were spoken there. So given this, and also Chukotka-Kamchatkan speakers today are genetically quite distant from all other Siberian populations. So it's pretty plausible that all the rest came later and they are the most ancient humans which are still there in the Arctic. So there is no way to connect modern Arctic languages to the population of the Arctic back to 40,000 years ago. And so when we discuss language spreads in the Arctic, we actually discussed only the last 4,000 years, which is a disappointment to an extent. But still, it's 2,000 or 4,000 years. That's also quite a lot if you think about human life duration. So, language families of the Arctic. This is a very colorful list because I tried to match the color of the letters to the color on the map. So I just briefly go through them. So we start here with Chukotka-Kamchatkan languages at the Russian Far East. Then we have in pink Athabaskan Eyak-Tlingit language family, which actually Eyak-Tlingit are two small languages beyond the Arctic area, and the Athabascans are the rest of this language family. Then we have Aleut Yupik Inuit. Again, we have only Aleut here, and then we have some Yupik languages, and then we have Inuit languages over huge territories in Northern America and Greenland. Then we have several Uralic branches, but importantly, each of this Uralic branch arrived to the Arctic independently. So in a sense, these are four separate language spreads if we speak about the Arctic. So Northern Samoyedic are here, and they kind of came from the south, from Siberian south. Then we have OeAD-GmbH Hunty, which came to the north independently of the Samoyedic speakers. Then we have recently Ijmakomi, which came here, and then we have Samic, which came from European south, okay, maybe European Central Europe to more Arctic territories. Then we have Yukagiric languages, which are today only two, Kolema or Tundra Yukagir. Tundra Yukagir and Kolema or Forest Yukagir. But it's clear that there were more Yukagiric languages, just because at least by the time of Russian colonization in the 16th century, there were many more groups which belong to the same units as the currently existing Yukagir-speaking clans. And also it was suggested that Yukagiric languages and Uralic languages are either related or were in intense contact. So they really share some important structural features, meaning that because Uralic languages were spoken not in the Arctic originally, but in southern Siberia, meaning that Yukagiric languages also had to be spoken somewhere more to the south. Then we have Evenic, which is brown here, which is a huge area covered by two languages, Evenki more to the west and Even more to the east. They have dialects, but these dialects are not very different. So it's rather still just two languages, Even and Evenki. Then we have two Turkic languages, Dolgan here and here, and Yakut or Sakha here. The main area of Sakha language is more to the south, but they also have they have also spread to the Arctic, to the expense of Yukagiric languages as well. Okay. So here we have the language families, and now we want to speak about the language spreads of the Arctic. And actually here, I suggest you again to go to breakout rooms and together look at this list of diversification dates on the one hand, and the direction of dispersal over landmass on the other hand, and try to think how you can group all those spreads into waves, and how you can justify why it is a plausible really wave when several spreads happened together. I again will send to Kat, yes, the slide with this list so that you can use it in the breakout rooms. And so your task, you have 10 minutes, and your task is to try to group these diversifications and dispersals into waves. There are several waves based on the timing and on the geographic features that you can see on the map. Ksenia, will you help us? Thank you.
Yes, this time I just created random groups, and everyone is welcome to join theirs.
So now it's 8 o'clock, so you have time till 8:10 to, or maybe 8:07. Let's make it 7 minutes.
So everyone is back now. And also there is a question in the chat, so you might take a look at it and decide whether you take it now or later. The question here is, Laszlo is asking, maybe I missed it, but how do you define Arctic? Is it based simply on latitude or rather the tundra zone? How do you define the notion of Arctic language? For instance, Ijmakomi arrived to the supposed zone not much earlier than Norwegian or Russian, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you. I don't know why I don't see the question, but thanks for answering. And that was exactly what I wanted to start with, on commenting a bit this map. maybe even the previous one without the arrows. Here in blue, you have a circle, you have polar circle. And so the narrow definition of the Arctic is everything which is to the north of the polar circle. But actually in red, you have a much more irregular territory, which is called Arctic by consensus, by researchers working in the Arctic, by Arctic people, by people living in the Arctic. So there is this kind of environmental and cultural understanding of the term Arctic, and it is shown in red here, which means a territory covered with permafrost, and on the one hand, but also with continuing traditional activities till today, like Aleut Islands do not have permafrost as far as I remember, but they are kind of still have a lot of indigenous traditional activities, so that they also joined here. I will speak at the next slide about Ujmakomi and Norwegians. So I hope that will answer the next question. So as far as I could see, some of you have managed to arrive at some of these waves. Now I will summarize them for you. So initially, yes, the eldest, the most old splits or diversification of languages happened around 3,500 and 4,000 years before present. And here we see the kind of the basic splits in the three most ancient language families, and they're all centered geographically around Bering Strait, like kind of Bering area. So the Chukotka-Kamchatka languages split into Chukotkan and Kamchatkan. The Aleut-Yupik Inuit languages split into Aleut versus Yupik Inuit, and the Athabaskan Ayak Tlingit languages split into Athabaskan, Ayak, and Tlingit. For all these splits, for all these three families, the Arctic is their only homeland. So we do not know about we have no evidence, either linguistic or non-linguistic, that these groups speaking like Proto-Chukotka-Kamchatkan, Proto-Aleut-Yupik Inuit, and so on, lived elsewhere and not in the Arctic. So these are kind of the most ancient and the most kind of Arctic ones, meaning that they never, they were always in the Arctic. Clearly, if we think about these language families, we see only three language families around the Bering Strait or a bit more into the Americas, and the rest of the Arctic was inhabited, as we have seen, as I have mentioned, but no language families which was spoken in the other parts of the Arctic 3,500 or 4,000 years ago did not survive. No language family survived till today. So it's rather that these are the three old language families which we had in the Arctic back then and still have them now, but all the others were replaced by later language spreads. Was there a question in the chat? Or was there someone coming?
Yeah, I think that was just a person joining. Oh, there is now.
Okay, because there is the sound, which is for both. The question is there any evidence of replacement of other families that were in the Arctic before the arrival of these new waves? Yes, there is continuity of human inhabitants by archaeological remains in many areas of the Arctic. So we know that people lived there and lived there and lived there. And then, like, as in the next wave, we will see that in about 2,000 years ago, some other languages arrived to the north, but we know that other people lived there, so they must have been speaking some other languages. We know nothing about the amount of people who lived there, so because the Arctic area, when we have archaeological remains, it means we know that something exists, but there is no full coverage. So we cannot estimate how many people lived there because it's very hard to do any archaeological research over there. And usually any archaeological remains are discovered by chance because something else is being done there, or some oil exploration, or some just because permafrost melts, and then you can it just something very old can go out at the riverbank, for example. So we know that people lived there, but we don't know how numerous they were. And we know that they spoke some languages because Homo sapiens spoke some languages 4,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, but that were not the languages that we see now today. So about 2,000 years ago, we have several language families which diversified about that date, and they are Samic, Samoyedic, and Yukagiric. So Samic and Samoyedic are two Uralic branches, but they kind of first separated from the rest of Uralic in a more southern areas, and then they moved northwards. And this kind of the diversification of Samic, the diversification of Samoyedic, and the diversification of Yukagiric happened about 2,000 years ago, maybe 2,500 years ago. And at some point they came to the north, but it's very hard. Like so far, we cannot estimate whether they split and immediately spread to the north, or whether it was another 500, 700, 800 years before they could be discovered in the north. So when we say 2,000 years ago, we mean start of the spread, but not the actual region of the Arctic. And actually, so these were three families, Samic, Samoyedic, and Yukagiric, or branches, which originated in the south. But actually the Athabascan, which were in the Arctic by that time, by 2,500 years ago, they started to spread, to diversify. Like the level of divergence in modern Athabascan languages is about 2,000, 2,500 years. And the same happens to, like, not the same, but this language family, Aleut, Yupik, Inuit, the initial split between Aleut and the rest happened about 4,000 years ago, but the break of Yupik and Inuit happened about 2,000 years ago. So this is the time when several families spread. When we speak about simultaneity here, this is very relative because it's such a big time depth that it could be that a couple of hundreds of years separate these events. But still, if we think about several thousand years, they're kind of near each other. And also, yes, as I mentioned, there is archaeological and genetic evidence that earlier languages were replaced by these newer languages, Samic, Samoyedic, and Yukagiric, and they were replaced both by population admixture and language shift, so that we see southern genetic signal in modern Yukagiric, Samoyedic, and Samic speaking groups, but we also see something unattested in the south, so as if it is the genetic signal from the humans which were there when these more southern languages arrived. So it's a kind of combination of population admixture and language shift. So some humans migrated from the south to the north, and they brought their languages with them, and they assimilated, they mixed with the local population, and the local population switched to their languages. Okay, I will speak about environment in the next slide. So I will leave the question till then. And if I don't answer it, I can go back to it. Okay, and then 1,000 years ago, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 geographic spreads in the Arctic. So Yupik languages diversified over into Siberian Yupik in the Chukotkan Peninsula and into okay, maybe I'll show actually a map here. Yes, so 1,000 years ago, we have these Yupik guys spreading over this territory. We have Inuit languages spreading along huge territory. We have Chukchi languages, which also spread, well, it looks not so big as Inuit, but it actually is a couple of thousands of kilometers southwards and westwards. And we have Tundra-Nenets, which is a language spoken from here till here, which is again a couple of thousands of kilometers, like 3,000 kilometers, I think, which is a huge territory. And so we see that these spreads, which result into the same language or similar languages, very similar languages, being spoken along vast territories, happened recently. And about 200 years ago, about 200 years ago, the fourth wave here, we have the last wave of indigenous expansion. These were the Turkic languages which came to the Siberian north, Dolgan and Yakut. This was Izhmakomi, which came to the Western Siberian north. And then actually the Chukotkan language and Avanic languages and Tundra-Nenets, which kind of started their spread 1,000 years ago, consolidated this, kind of further increased and consolidated this over large territories. And a bit later, or in Europe, actually, as was mentioned for Norwegians, at the same time, colonial languages also arrived to the Arctic. So kind of, if you think about waves of incoming people, then I see no reason why not to include colonial languages here as well. And so we just took only 4,000 years, but we see lots of linguistic immigration and expansion, which is kind of not something you expect from such a harsh environment. So kind of, why do people come here, and why, even if they are already there, why don't they just stay where they are, where they have adapted? And so why to expand and to look for anything else? And so that's how we come to the question of the reasons for the spread. As Johanna Nichols puts in her typology of spread zones, she says that Northern Asia is one or actually two interconnected spread zones: the steppe, which is kind of the more southern part of Northern Asia, and the subarctic to Arctic North. And this is exactly the area that we are talking about, is the subarctic and Arctic North in Eurasia, but also in North America. There can be seen several reasons for the expansions. First, the transport emerges and rises. So dog transportation about 2,000 years ago, or a bit further back. And then about 200 years ago, 300 years ago, large-scale reindeer herding emerges. So it's kind of, before there was only transport reindeer herding and dogs and reindeer used for transport. But about that time, 250 years ago, 300 years ago, really huge herds of reindeer become possible. And that's how some of these groups, Chukchi-speaking people and Tundra-Nenets-speaking people and Evenki and Avan-speaking people actually spread in the last hundreds of years because of this large-scale reindeer herding. And actually, large-scale reindeer herding requires cold and open spaces. So you can't have a large herd of reindeer in the forest area. So kind of, even if this the most unwelcome area is become economically useful. And then there were also pushes from more southern groups, which with higher population density, so that the more southern groups, they were expanded, and so these guys who are now in the north had to go to the north. And also there were pushes from the Russian colonizers in Siberia, and also there were environmental changes, meaning climate events, which influenced mainly fauna, but also flora, and also forest fires, which were brought by the Russian colonizers, was an environmental change which caused people to go more to the north. Okay, we don't have much time, but there were several climate events which kind of coincide with these big waves. And so it is possible that this synchronicity of waves was actually conditioned by climate changes, which are kind of common for the area. Okay. I think we need to go here quickly. The sociolinguistic profile of the Arctic. Everyone in the Arctic has lived as nomads till very recently, meaning there were no settlements before white colonizers in the last 200, 100 years. And if you have nomadic groups, then it means that you have intermittent contact, because nomadic groups have their migration waves and they depend on environmental features and they change with time. And so the same groups migrate not, kind of the same ethnic group would migrate not along the same routes that their grandparents did, for example, just because the environment changes and you need to explore, to use many resources. So you can't follow the same route all the same time. And it means that in the Arctic, we often have intermittent contact between groups, meaning that groups come into contact and go out of contact. They can be near each other for 100 years, for 200 years, but then they won't be near each other. But then maybe 500 years later, they would again be near each other. So this is very specific type of contact, which is not attested by settled population. And that's why geography is very bad predictor for anything social in the north. And also here, because of the harsh conditions and low population density, the dependence on networks of mutual help is much higher than in other parts of the world. And this is kind of a very general thing, that the greater ecological risk, the larger social network you need to survive. And if you have a large social network in the Arctic with low population density, it means also that you have a very geographically large social network. And the Arctic social networks, some of them share the proto-language. So, and we are kind of, there was one social network between speakers of related languages, like Samoyedic, for example, or Athabascan in Alaska. And there was hostility to kind of neighboring groups who didn't speak a related language, like between Samoyedic and Evenic languages, between Athabascan speakers and Yupik Inuit speakers. But it's not necessarily so, because we have some groups in Eastern Siberia who spoke unrelated languages, but formed one social network. An important thing about these Arctic social networks is that they shared ritual practices, they shared folklore, they had very widespread practice of receptive multilingualism. And also often they lacked native ethnonyms that would correspond to languages as we linguists understand them. So kind of all speakers of Samoyedic languages would call themselves Samoyeds without further differentiation, or Samis, as you might know from the previous lecture, or Athabascans. They don't have any native names for, they can use the name of a river or a name of some mountain, but there is no kind of ethnic groups that would call themselves anything different than this kind of huge group of related languages. And actually, such language ideologies are uncommon for resource-rich areas. So if we look at indigenous societies of Amazonia, Australia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Oceania, Papua New Guinea, then it's very common there that every village has one village, one language, one ethnic group, because own language is kind of claimed that you have when you have an own language, you can claim the right to own social group, and own social group has own land. And kind of that's how kind of languages and resources are connected in these parts of the world. But this is not the case in the Arctic. In the Arctic, there was no kind of economic or ideological push to claim that your language is different from the language of your neighbors. On the contrary, there was these networks of mutual help meant that people considered all these languages the same. Oh, I don't have much time left, but basically, because of this continuity in ethnic groups, And because of this multilingualism within related languages, we have abrupt lack of language splits, and we have slow diversification in contact. And there was a lot of dialect and language continuum in the recent past, and the language borders that we see today actually are due to loss of intermediate languages and to state borders, not to kind of something inherent. And important thing is that the innovations spread among these related languages after they separated. So they separated, but then because of this intermittent contact, they became again, they found themselves near each other. And so you have kind of secondary convergence or spread of some linguistic features, which is orthogonal to this kind of original diversification. And so basically then we have isoglosses, phonological, morphological, and lexical, which intersect so that it's low-level genealogical grouping in all of the language families of the Arctic are very complicated. So you can't build neat trees. Okay, and so finishing it is some of the answers that these studies of language spreads in the Arctic give to these general research questions. But this is mainly the recapitulation of what I have said. So I think I can skip pronouncing them and you will have the slides. Thank you. But I can stay for a bit more to answer the question.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think that we had at least one question in the chat earlier, so maybe you could answer that one if you feel that you need to add something to the things that you have already said.
So definitely permafrost means that you can't have sedentary agriculture. And permafrost means if you don't have sedentary agriculture, it means you have hunting and gathering and fishing. And it means that you need to travel to get your resources. And so maybe that's why kind of, yes, it's kind of on the one hand, we are surprised that in such area, which is so difficult to live, people moved so much. But on the other hand, this is the answer because it was so difficult to live there. So they had to move in order to survive. Yeah.
Okay, do we have any further questions? Okay, well, if not, then I guess we'll just thank Olesya very much once again. So thank you very much for the lecture. And I will upload, as usual, the recording and I will share the slides with you.
And
yes.
I will send you the slides so that you would share them.
That was my hope. Okay, yeah. So thank you very much once again. I will stop the recording now.